Let's speak with Theo Usherwood, political commentator, friend of this programme, of course. Theo, afternoon to you.
A very good afternoon to you, Ian.
Nice to have you with us as ever. It's just worth picking up on something first. Keir Starmer's unpopularity hits a three-year high. Now, of course, this includes his time in opposition as well. He's only been Prime Minister for about half an hour. But certainly the winter fuel cuts and things like that would not have been helpful to that stat.
He shouldn't be in this position at this stage. If you compare him to David Cameron when he became Prime Minister in 2010, Keir Starmer compares badly. When you compare him to Boris Johnson in 2019, Keir Starmer compares badly. It's not really fair to compare him to Theresa May because, of course, the general election that she held in 2017 was about a year after she became Prime Minister. So it's Cameron and Johnson in 2019 that are the fair comparisons. And in both cases, Keir Starmer does not compare well. And given where we are at the moment in this Parliament, very early on, we're only 69, 70 days into his tenure as Prime Minister. He should be doing a lot better. And to be fair to Keir Starmer, he was doing better in those first 2 or 3 weeks. He actually got his favourability to a net zero score after he had, quite a fast start to his time as Prime Minister with trips to Washington. And he was seen as being quite, he was seen as actually implementing what he said he was going to implement during the general election in terms of immigration and fast-tracking growth in the economy. But since the riots took hold in the summer, the beginning of end of July, early August, his ratings have plummeted.
Yeah. We were asking the question at the beginning, quite almost thinking out loud, Theo. You know how these things work. What is the Labour government trying to achieve? And it's very hard. I think if a student of politics was asked to write a dissertation on that, they would probably struggle. If you were attempting to get to the sort of core of the ideology or the direction of travel, it's quite hard. I know that 55% of the public believe Britain is heading in the wrong direction. I know that if you ask a question about any government at any time, a lot of people will say they don't know what they're doing, they're a bit rubbish. It's almost goes with the territory of being in power that you get criticised. I get all of that, but it is a reasonable question to wonder where they're going, because at the moment I can't really join anything up.
Yeah, so look, if you compare, and this is worth just bearing in mind, if you compare Keir Starmer to the remaining Conservative leadership candidates, there's only one in terms of these favourability ratings who actually does better, and that's Tom Tugendhat. And that's important because we don't yet have that juxtaposition between the Prime Minister and the leader of the Conservative Party, because the leader of the Conservative Party has yet to be chosen. And it's all very well saying, Keir Starmer's doing really badly, but if the leader of the opposition is faring even worse, then in actual fact, he's doing okay because he's not doing as badly as the other guy. But I think you raise a very fair point that Keir Starmer hasn't yet, and he was trying to do this, I think, with his speech to the TUC, the Trade Unions Congress down in Brighton this week, but actually managed to establish a narrative about what he wants to achieve so that the voting public can at least have a chance of buying into that. He talks about working people, but at the same time, there are many pensioners who are saying, I've worked hard all my life, I'm on a fixed income, I need my winter fuel allowance in order to get through. And because they're pensioners, they don't have the option, they don't have the option just to go out and work that extra shift, do that, few hours of overtime to make up the difference. And I think it does not sit well with the overarching narrative that Keir Starmer was trying to talk about during the general election, that actually he wants to create a much fairer society which looks after the most vulnerable.
That's what he would say. Look, I don't know whether this next point is fair or unfair, but if it's unfair, it's equally as unfair to all political parties. But I do wonder whether, when it comes to popularity, what we think about those in power, those who govern us, Theo, they get less time, really, to impress, don't they, due to the sort of instantaneous nature of news, the 24-hour cycle, the cacophony of opinion. Whereas not so long ago, people would wait for their morning newspaper. They might read a bit of news. They'd watch, Trevor McDonald on the news at 10, and that was kind of largely it. You might clock an episode of Question Time once in a while. Now, of course, we have pesky people like us who talk about this stuff incessantly. We have social media, all manner of other avenues to debate and discuss. I think it's probably harder for political parties to maintain credible momentum than it's ever been.
Yes, I think it is. And I also think just it's worth bearing in mind, Ian, that everything that Keir Starmer has talked about when it comes to turning the economy around, fixing the NHS, everything is a 10-year plan. So it's not like the Prime Minister and his aides in number 10 can turn around and say, well, the polls don't matter.
Yeah.
We've got time. We can turn around. Because he needs to win another general election in order to achieve the success that he has set out that he wants to achieve.
Yeah.
This week when he gave his diagnosis of the NHS and he said, how long is it going to take to fix? It's going to take 10 years. Well, he's going to then need to win a general election in 2029.
Yeah.
So these polls really do matter if everything that he has set out and everything that his aides are setting out is a 10-year programme to fix the country. So it's when we're talking, when we're conversing, and your listeners are thinking, well, it's just the polls and we're just a few days into the electoral cycle, a matter of days, weeks into the electoral cycle. Well, these polls don't matter because the general election is going to, it's not going to come around for another 4.5 years. Well, by contrast, I think they actually do matter. And the other thing to say is that if you think back to Rishi Sunak and what he was trying to achieve, he did have some limited success. We saw the small boats crossing dropped by a third between 2022 and 2023. We saw inflation reduced back down to target, but it didn't matter because public's opinion had already been set in their minds. This was a government that had failed to deliver. So even when Rishi Sunak had some limited success, and there was a huge amount of frustration amongst the Tories at that particular time because they weren't able to tell that story because the public had, in a sense, come to its own conclusions that this was an ineffectual government. They were looking back to what Liz Truss did. They were looking back to the chaos under Boris Johnson, and they weren't prepared to change their minds. And I think Keir Starmer, he may think at the moment, well, I'm going to turn the country around. I've got this plan. But if you fast forward and the narrative is set now, and it's being set now about where he is failing, whether it's the winter fuel allowance, whether it's paying, upwards of £10 billion to train drivers and other public sector workers in order to just get them to do their job. And people think, actually, this isn't a government that's for me and is representing my interests, then that is dangerous for the Prime Minister because he's now in a position where he has to change their minds. And that's much more difficult than actually if you have an open mind and you're willing to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt for a period of time before deciding whether everything that he has promised he will do, he has actually done.
Yeah. Let's move to this story, Theo. Low-skilled migrants cost taxpayer £150,000 a year, £150,000 each. The reason I'm interested in this is because I'm interested in the whole. This is legal immigration, by the way. It's not people crossing the channel, of course. We're often told that we need massive amounts of people because indigenous, for want of a better term, the indigenous population are not filling those jobs. Not everybody is a rocket scientist or a top surgeon. Some might be, but broadly speaking, low-skilled workers are filling the void in so many areas, but the OBR have crunched the numbers on this and realised that low-paid migrant workers cost UK taxpayer over £150,000 each by the time they reach state pension age. So ultimately there is no gain in this if the finances are the only indicator.
Yes, I think what's interesting about this particular story, and this is from the Independent, of course, Office for Budget Responsibility, is found actually when you're looking at those who are coming into this country because they're coming in for things to do jobs that we're unable to fill amongst those who live here, and they're coming into particularly around health and social care, and they're coming in on health and social care visas to fill those gaps in the labour market that actually, because of the services that they end up using and because they're on relatively low wages, therefore what they're paying into the exchequer in terms of tax is relatively low, that actually they end up drawing more out of the state than they end up putting in. And of course, the government, and this was the name of the Conservative government, and it's the name of the Labour government, because, of course, Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper, they've set up this Skills England to try and train up young people being educated in this country to fill those jobs that at the moment are being filled by people coming here on things like health and social care visas, and they're trying to reverse this trend. But I think what's problematic about this is that if you look at, let's take nursing, for example. I looked this up just before I came on air. It costs between £15,000 and £34,000 if you want to pay to do a course to train to be a nurse. Now, your average salary when you're starting is going to be somewhere in the late 20s, maybe the early 30s, depending on where you begin your career as a nurse once you are fully qualified. But you can only apply for a grant of £5,000 in order to cover some of those costs. Now, I'm not one, Ian, to sit here as somebody who has a professional job, and I'm sure you're not, and begrudge the train drivers being paid, now upwards of £70,000 a year. I feel deeply uncomfortable when you listen to those in the professional classes saying, well, I don't think a train driver should be paid £70,000 a year. But they don't have skill shortages. What I do think is potentially where you could look at the workforce and say, this is a problem, is if you have nurses who are on, who don't necessarily have the ability to strike in the same way that those who work on the train network have to have, and to have the same effect, who are then saying, actually, if you want to improve that situation, the government needs to put more money into the grants to fund people to train to do nursing jobs and to pay them decent salaries so that actually they can have decent, comfortable, well-paid and be well remunerated. We're not talking, massive sums. Nobody's expecting them to live like millionaires. But actually, if you can do that, then you don't need to rely on people coming into this country on health and social care visas. And then, of course, ultimately, it's what ends up costing the state more because, of course, as we were just discussing, they pay less into the system, less into the exchequer than they end up taking out.
Indeed. Final story here, Theo. Sadiq Khan refusing to rule out sending in the bailiffs. This is the unpaid ULEZ fines. Drivers who fail to pay those fines, of course, could be faced with bailiffs because there's a £400 million shortfall there. TfL, Transport for London, owed £400 million in outstanding fines. An extraordinary amount of money. This, of course, is all part and parcel of, or part of the reason is that it's part and parcel of the ULEZ expansion. So there's a lot of debt going around there, and Mr Khan has said he's not beyond the possibility of sending round the boys to nick your flat screen.
I think he'll be very unpopular if he does exactly that. And of course, this ULEZ scheme has only been in place just over a year. Yeah. It was deeply unpopular when it was. And actually, if you look at the numbers in terms of compliance, it's now to around 97%. So most drivers who are driving into London have a compliant vehicle. And I think you raised an important point just when we started this hour in, the vast majority of vehicles in a couple of years' time, ULEZ itself, if we're going to stick with the current, is going to be redundant, unless, of course, the mayor decides to, in effect, gradually limit the boundaries of how it works. So, for instance, at the moment, it applies to any petrol car, basically, that's around 20 years old. But he might turn around and say, actually, ULEZ is now going to apply to a petrol car that is 10 years or younger.
That's
so
almost...
Could actually he could start restricting it even further. Diesel cars, of course, it's around 2016. Yeah. If you look, it depends on the engine and when it came into effect. But he could say, actually, ULEZ, we're going to change the restrictions now of ULEZ, and ULEZ could apply to any diesel car that was made before 2020.
Correct.
And so you could end up in a situation where actually this becomes more and more restrictive to the point at which the only cars which aren't ULEZ compliant are electric vehicles. So it's worth just bearing in mind that this policy, ULEZ itself, because they've spent all of this money on the infrastructure, it doesn't just have to stop here.
That's exactly. Well, that's what's going to happen because based on how it is right now, it would never get past Dragon's dent, would it? I mean, Peter Jones would go, well, this is a ridiculous business plan because in 3 years' time, nobody will be driving those vehicles. They will naturally disappear. It's such a small percentage of drivers you're trying to get. I think it's something less than 10%, I think, of drivers that everybody else is compliant. So you're spending hundreds of millions of pounds. The Mayor allocated 152 million to firms tasked with tracking down and recovering unpaid fines. Given all the amount of money, you are forced to recognise precisely what you just said, Theo, that this is only phase one of the use of the current ULEZ project.
And I think ultimately, where it's going to go is to dynamic road pricing. I think that's going to be the next thing. Whether it's Sadiq Khan who does it or another mayor who does it, I think that's where Transport for London ultimately they want to take this. So you could have cameras along every road in London, and then you can change the prices accordingly, whether you're driving in at peak times or you're driving at night, and you just have to pay right across the board. But of course, that will favour those. It will favour those who have the money in the back pockets to buy the latest electric vehicle. It will favour those who have large semi-detached houses or detached houses where you can park your car on your driveway and plug it into the mains and charge it up. And it will be the poorest, inevitably. And this was always the complaint when ULEZ was introduced, because I was speaking to people who represented the care industry. Carers, of course, need to drive. You can't, attend 15 homes of elderly people if you're doing it on public transport. But it's those at the bottom who rely on their cars, who can't afford the latest version, who can't afford to keep on upgrading their cars, who are ultimately going to suffer. Yeah.
On that point, Theo, as ever, thank you. Have a cracking weekend. He is Theo Usherwood, political commentator, friend of the programme, of course, right here at the home of Common Sense.